Linda had always been good at hiding her true nature. To the outside world, she was the perfect wife, supportive, charming, and always smiling at the right moments. No one saw the coldness behind her eyes when she looked at Emily, her stepdaughter. Emily was a bright, gentle child with an innocent heart. She adored her father, clinging to every moment she could spend with him. He was her protector, her hero. But he worked long hours, leaving Emily under Linda's care most of the time. To the little girl, Linda was distant, never truly motherly. She longed for love but received only cold stares and indifference. Behind closed doors, Linda's resentment grew. She saw Emily as an obstacle, an unwanted burden from her husband's past. The girl was a constant reminder that Linda wasn't the first woman in his life. And to make matters worse, Emily's presence meant that Linda couldn't fully control her husband. He doted on his daughter, spent money on her, and prioritized her happiness. It infuriated Linda. Her cruelty was subtle but effective. She would prepare meals and accidentally forget to include Emily's portion. She would buy gifts for herself and pretend she had forgotten Emily's birthday. When her husband was home, she played the role of a kind stepmother. But the moment he left, her tone would change. A sharp remark here, a dismissive glare there. It was enough to make Emily feel unwanted, but not enough to raise suspicion. Emily, still too young to understand, never told her father. She assumed she had to try harder to make Linda love her. She did chores without being asked, tried to win her stepmother's approval with kind words, and even gave up her favourite toys when Linda claimed they were cluttering the house. But no matter what Emily did, it was never enough. Linda's true nature remained hidden from her husband. He was a loving father, but too trusting. He believed that his wife and daughter were slowly bonding, unaware of the darkness brewing in Linda's heart. She had learned to be patient, to wear a mask. And as the days passed, an idea began to form in her mind, one that would change their lives forever. Linda had always craved luxury. She loved fine jewelry, designer dresses, and expensive dinners that made her feel like royalty. But maintaining that lifestyle required money, more than her husband's steady but modest income could provide. So she found other ways. At first, it was just harmless fun, small bets at private poker games, a few risky investments. But greed had a way of spiraling out of control. Soon Linda was drowning in debt. She owed money to dangerous people, men who didn't accept late payments or excuses. The threats started as subtle warnings, but quickly escalated. One night, she found a note slipped under the door. "Pay up or you'll regret it." Fear gripped her chest. She needed a way out, and she needed it fast. That was when she met Mr. Blackwell. He was wealthy, powerful, and, most importantly, well-connected. His reputation was shadowy. People whispered that he was involved in all kinds of illicit businesses, but no one dared to ask too many questions. He approached Linda at a high-end bar, where she had gone to drown her worries in expensive wine she couldn't afford. "I hear you have a problem," he said smoothly, taking a seat beside her. Linda stiffened but didn't deny it. Mr. Blackwell smiled. "I'm offering you a solution." She expected him to propose a loan, maybe an illegal business deal. Instead, his next words left her frozen. "I'll pay you a generous amount for the girl." Her breath caught in her throat. Emily. He wanted Emily. For a moment, Linda was horrified. Even she had limits. But as Mr. Blackwell named the price, her resolve wavered. It was more money than she had ever seen in her life, enough to erase her debts and start fresh. Enough to finally have the life she deserved without Emily in the way. Still, she hesitated. "It's not that simple," she muttered, gripping her glass tightly. "It is," Mr. Blackwell replied. "Make her disappear. People assume children vanish all the time. Runaways, kidnappings. Tragic but common." Linda spent the next few days battling her conscience. But as the debts piled up and the threats became more aggressive, she convinced herself that it was the only way. If she didn't do this, she might end up dead. She crafted a plan. One night, Emily would simply vanish. Linda would pretend to be distraught, play the grieving stepmother. No one would ever suspect her. The money would be hers and she would finally be free. With her decision made, Linda contacted Mr. Blackwell. "I'll do it," she whispered into the phone. "Good choice," he said, his voice cold but satisfied. "I'll make the arrangements." As she hung up, a strange feeling settled in her stomach. She told herself it was relief, but deep down she knew it was something else. Guilt. And once she started down this path, there would be no turning back. The night was colder than usual, the kind of chill that settled deep into the bones. The sky was clouded, casting the world in eerie darkness. Linda gripped the steering wheel tightly as she drove down the desolate road, her knuckles turning white. In the passenger seat, Emily sat quietly, her small hands clutching the teddy bear her father had given her. "Where are we going?" Emily asked, her voice laced with curiosity. Linda forced a smile. "Just a little trip. A surprise?" Emily brightened at that. "A surprise? For me?" Linda nodded but said nothing more. She focused on the road, ignoring the gnawing unease in her chest. She had made up her mind. There was no turning back now. The drive felt endless, but eventually they reached an abandoned rest stop near the outskirts of town. It was the kind of place people ignored, too eerie and forgotten for anyone to linger. The headlights illuminated a lone figure standing by a black car. "Mr. Blackwell." Emily shifted uncomfortably. "I don't like this place," she whispered. Linda ignored her. She parked the car and stepped out, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. Mr. Blackwell approached, dressed in his usual tailored suit, his expression unreadable. "Right on time," he said smoothly. He looked past Linda, his sharp gaze settling on Emily, who was still seated in the car. "Bring her," he ordered. Linda hesitated. For the first time, the full weight of what she was doing hit her. This was her husband's daughter, an innocent child who trusted her. But then she thought of the money, of the threats from the people she owed. It was her or Emily. She walked to the car and opened the door. "Come on, sweetheart." Emily frowned but obeyed. As soon as she stepped out, she saw Mr. Blackwell and instinctively took a step back. "Who is he?" she asked, her voice trembling. Linda crouched beside her, forcing another smile. "He's a friend. He's going to take you somewhere safe." Emily's eyes filled with fear. "I don't want to go with him. Please, let's go home." She grabbed Linda's sleeve, clinging desperately. Linda pried her off, her touch cold and detached. "Be a good girl, Emily." Emily started crying. "Please, Mommy." "I am not your mother," Linda snapped, her voice sharp. Mr. Blackwell stepped forward and grabbed Emily's arm. She screamed, struggling against his grip, but he was too strong. He dragged her toward his car, her cries echoing in the empty night. Linda turned away, refusing to watch. A thick envelope was shoved into her hands. "Pleasure doing business," Mr. Blackwell said. The car door slammed shut. The tires screeched against the pavement. And just like that, Emily was gone, her terrified screams fading into the distance. Linda stood motionless, staring at the money in her hands. It was over, or so she thought. Linda drove home in silence, her hands still gripping the steering wheel as if letting go would shatter the illusion she had carefully constructed. The weight of the envelope filled with cash sat beside her, a stark reminder that there was no turning back. She had done it. Emily was gone. As she stepped inside the house, she rehearsed her act one last time. Panic, fear, grief. She had to make it believable. She took a deep breath, then let out a piercing scream. "Emily! Oh my God, she's gone!" Her husband, startled from his sleep, rushed down the stairs. "What? What do you mean?" Linda's tears, forced but convincing, spilled down her cheeks. I woke up and checked on her, but she wasn't there. The window was open. I think she ran away." He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his phone and called the police, his hands shaking. Within the hour, their home was filled with officers, flashing lights painting the walls in shades of blue and red. Linda sat on the couch, pretending to be a broken woman, while her husband paced the room, his face pale with worry. The search began immediately. Flyers were printed, neighbours questioned, and police dogs sniffed around the house and nearby woods. But there was no trace of Emily. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Linda played her role well. She sobbed in front of the cameras, pleading for Emily to come home. She held her husband's hand tightly, whispering words of comfort. But inside she felt nothing but relief. Days turned into weeks, then months. The case went cold. The police concluded that Emily had likely run away, as there was no sign of a struggle. Linda had covered her tracks too well. With time, life slowly returned to normal, at least for Linda. The money Mr. Blackwell had given her allowed her to indulge in the luxuries she had always wanted. Expensive clothes, fine dining, secret getaways. Her husband, however, was never the same. He became obsessed with finding Emily, spending countless nights researching missing persons cases, reaching out to private investigators, and following every false lead. His grief consumed him. Linda pretended to share his pain, but in truth she wished he would just let it go. She had won. She was free. Or so she thought. Because somewhere out there Emily still existed, and secrets like these never stayed buried forever. The years passed, and Linda's life became everything she had once dreamed of. The money she had received for Emily's disappearance had been the start of something greater. With her husband too distracted by his grief to notice, she manipulated him into making smarter financial investments, convincing him to move into a bigger house to buy her finer things. To the outside world, she was a devoted wife standing by a broken man. But behind the closed doors of their luxurious home, she basked in the life she had stolen for herself. Emily was nothing but a distant memory now. At least that's what Linda told herself. Her husband, however, never moved on. While Linda enjoyed expensive vacations and shopping sprees, he remained trapped in the past. Every year on Emily's birthday, he would light a candle and stare at her old photos. He joined online forums for missing persons, hired private detectives, and followed every potential lead. Linda grew frustrated. She had given him years to forget the girl, yet he refused. "You need to let it go," she told him one evening, her voice sharper than she intended. His tired eyes met hers. "I can't. She's out there somewhere, I can feel it." Linda turned away, rolling her eyes, but deep down a strange unease began creeping into her bones. And then the letters started arriving. The first one was simple. "I know what you did." Linda nearly choked on her morning coffee when she saw it, her hands trembling as she reread the words. There was no signature, no return address. She burned it immediately, telling herself it was just a sick joke. But then came another. "She's not gone." Linda's paranoia grew. She started checking the locks twice before bed. Shadows outside the window made her jump. Was someone watching her? Had Mr. Blackwell betrayed her? Or worse, had Emily somehow survived? The eerie phone calls began soon after. Every time she answered, there was silence on the other end, except for the faint sound of breathing. One night she woke up drenched in sweat, convinced she had heard a whisper in the dark. "Mommy!" Her heart pounded violently against her ribs. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Linda tried to push the fear aside, to convince herself it was all in her head, but the more she ignored it, the worse it became. Then, one evening, her husband called for her from the study. "Linda," he said, holding up an envelope. His face was pale. "This letter came today." She took it with shaky hands and opened it. Inside was a single photograph of Emily, but she wasn't a child anymore. She was older now, stronger, and beneath the image, in neat handwriting, were 4 chilling words. "Did you miss me?" Linda's blood ran cold. Her perfect life was about to unravel. Linda could no longer ignore it. Someone knew what she had done. The letters, the phone calls, the eerie whispers in the dark, they were all leading to something. She had always believed Emily was gone forever, that the secret had been buried along with the child's disappearance. But now, it was as if the past was clawing its way back into her perfect life. The next letter arrived in a plain white envelope, left on the doorstep instead of in the mailbox. You thought she was gone. You were wrong. Linda's hands trembled as she read the words. A part of her wanted to dismiss it as a prank, but the pit in her stomach told her otherwise. Someone was watching her. Someone new. She decided to put an end to it. She called in a favor from an old acquaintance, someone with connections, the kind of people who could make problems disappear. I need someone found, she told the man over the phone. You mean silenced? Linda hesitated. Just handled. I need to know who's behind this. She thought she had taken control of the situation, but that night, another phone call came. This time when she answered, a voice whispered, You can't stop this. Linda's breath hitched. She slammed the phone down, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. At the same time, her husband received an email that made his entire world shift. It was from a private investigator he had hired years ago, a last-ditch effort to find Emily. He had long since given up hope, but the message was clear. I think I found something. Call me immediately. His hands shook as he dialed the number. When the investigator picked up, his voice was grave. There's a girl, he said. She fits Emily's description. Same birthmark on her wrist. She's been looking for her family. The father's heart nearly stopped. Where is she? I'll send you the location. But there's something else. She's been receiving threats? The room spun. His wife walked in, noticing the look on his face. What's wrong? She asked, feigning concern. He looked up, eyes filled with something she couldn't quite place. Hope? Suspicion? I think Emily is alive. Linda felt the air leave her lungs. For the first time in years, her husband's grief-stricken gaze wasn't just empty sorrow. It was determination. And if he kept searching, he would find her. Linda swallowed the rising panic. If Emily was alive, it wasn't just a problem, it was the end. She had spent years covering her tracks, erasing the past. But now, the truth was unraveling, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Linda had always believed Emily was gone forever. That was the one thing she had counted on, the foundation on which she had built her perfect life. But now, standing in the doorway of her lavish home, she felt her entire world collapse. Emily was back. She wasn't the fragile little girl Linda had last seen, crying and begging for mercy. The woman before her was strong, confident, dangerous. Her piercing eyes held no trace of fear. Instead, they burned with something far worse. Linda's throat went dry. Emily, she breathed, barely able to say the name. Emily smirked. You look surprised. Linda struggled to regain control. You were missing. We thought you were dead, Emily finished for her. Yeah, I bet you did. She stepped inside without an invitation, her presence suffocating. Linda's husband rushed into the room, his eyes widening in shock. Emily! His voice cracked as he stumbled forward, reaching for her. For the first time in years, Emily's expression softened. Dad. Tears filled his eyes as he pulled her into a tight embrace. I never stopped looking for you, he whispered. Emily's face hardened again as she pulled away. I know, that's why I came back. She turned to Linda, her smile cold, but not for a family reunion. Linda's stomach twisted. What do you want? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Emily took a slow step forward. You sold me, she said, voice filled with quiet fury. You let a stranger take me away, knowing what would happen. Linda shook her head. That's not true. I remember everything. Emily's voice was sharp as a knife. I remember crying for help while you looked away. I remember being locked in a car, screaming your name. And I remember what they did to me. Linda felt the blood drain from her face. Emily continued, her voice unwavering. I was taken across the country, sold like an object. They beat me when I tried to run. They starved me when I refused to obey. But I never forgot where I came from. And I never forgot you. Her father's face was etched with horror. Who? Who did this to you? Emily exhaled, steadying herself. I escaped. It took years, but I did it, and I gathered everything. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder, slamming it onto the table. Records, bank transactions, a witness statement from someone who helped me escape. Proof Linda's legs felt weak. You wouldn't. Emily leaned in, her voice low and cold. Oh, I would. She looked at her father. I came back to find you, but I also came back for justice. Linda had spent years thinking she had buried the past, but now it was standing in front of her, very much alive, and ready to destroy her. Within hours of Emily's return, the entire town knew what had happened. The loving stepmother they had once seen hosting charity events and smiling for family photos was now being whispered about in hushed voices. The news reports were relentless. The headlines screamed of betrayal, of a mother's greed, of a child stolen and sold into a nightmare. Linda sat frozen in her living room, staring blankly at the television as the news anchor repeated her name. Authorities have confirmed that Linda Reynolds is under investigation for her involvement in the disappearance of her stepdaughter, Emily Reynolds, nearly 15 years ago. Her breath came in short gasps. This isn't happening. But it was. Her husband, her once loyal husband, could barely look at her. His eyes, red from crying, burned with rage and heartbreak. I loved you, he whispered. I trusted you with my daughter. Linda shook her head, reaching for him. I made a mistake. I didn't have a choice. You have to believe me. He stepped back, disgust twisting his face. Number, the only mistake was ever letting you into our lives. Then came the knock at the door. Linda's body went rigid as the officers stepped inside, their expressions cold and unreadable. Linda Reynolds, one of them said. You're under arrest for conspiracy, human trafficking, and child endangerment. This is insane, she shrieked, struggling as they grabbed her wrists. I'm innocent. This is all a misunderstanding. But there was no misunderstanding. The evidence was stacked against her. The bank records, the testimonies, Emily's story. The officers pulled her toward the door, but she twisted desperately, locking eyes with Emily one last time. You did this, she hissed. You ruined me. Emily's expression was unreadable. Then she simply said, No. You did this to yourself. The handcuffs clicked into place. Linda screamed as she was dragged outside, flashing lights blinding her as reporters shoved microphones in her face. Linda, did you really sell your stepdaughter? Do you have anything to say to Emily? Do you feel remorse? She thrashed, trying to escape the cameras, but there was no hiding now. The mask had been ripped away, and the whole world finally saw her for what she truly was. A liar, a criminal, a traitor. As she was shoved into the back of the police car, the last thing she saw was Emily standing on the front porch beside her father. They weren't broken anymore. They weren't trapped in grief. They were free. And for the first time in her life, Linda was the one who had lost everything. The courtroom was packed. People from all over the town had come to witness the trial of Linda Reynolds, the woman who had once been a pillar of the community. But now, as the prosecution laid out their case, the whispers were filled with disbelief and anger. How could she do this? Linda sat at the defense table, her once pristine appearance now tarnished. Her face, once proud and confident, was drawn and hollow, her eyes devoid of the defiance they had once held. She had tried every defense, every lie, but the truth was undeniable. The evidence was damning. The testimonies were unassailable. She had sold her stepdaughter, Emily, for money, betraying her trust and stripping her of everything she had ever known. As the judge pronounced the sentence, 25 years to life, Linda's world collapsed. She was handcuffed and led away, her once lavish life slipping through her fingers like sand. Her lawyer tried to plead for leniency, but Linda's fate was sealed. Her crimes were too horrific, too damaging to be overlooked. The years of luxury, the high-end clothes, the expensive dinners, all of it had been built on lies, and now it was all gone. The father, still reeling from the revelation of his wife's betrayal, was present at the trial. When Emily took the stand to testify, her voice was steady, but the weight of the years of trauma was still evident in her eyes. She spoke of the pain, the fear, the years spent in captivity, and how Linda had been the one to set everything into motion. Emily's words were raw, but they were also a statement of survival. When the judge finally called for a recess, the father turned to Emily, his face full of regret. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I should have protected you. I should have seen the truth." Emily, her heart heavy with both anger and relief, placed a hand on his arm. "You couldn't have known. It wasn't your fault." But deep down she knew that despite his love, he couldn't have protected her from what had happened. She had struggled with the question of forgiveness. Could she forgive him? Could she forgive herself? But in that moment she realized that healing would take time. And it wasn't about forgiveness. It was about reclaiming her life, her identity, and her future. Linda's life behind bars was a far cry from the days of wealth and power. Once she had controlled everything, her home, her family, her world. Now she sat alone in a small prison cell, staring at the walls that had become her reality. The luxuries she had once indulged in were nothing more than fleeting memories. The money, the control, the status. It was all gone. And in its place was a harsh, unyielding truth. She had lost everything. In the end, Emily found her closure. The scars of her past would never fully disappear, but she was no longer shackled by the pain. With her father by her side, she began to rebuild, to reclaim the life she had lost, and while the past would always haunt her, the future was hers to shape. As for Linda, she would spend the rest of her life in prison, her fate sealed by her own greed and betrayal. Emily stood at the front of the room, her heart pounding as she looked at the group of survivors before her. Each of them had a story similar to hers, stories of broken trust, of being treated as nothing more than an object to be sold, discarded, and forgotten. But Emily had escaped, and now she was determined to help others do the same. She took a deep breath, steadying her nerves. "I'm Emily," she began, her voice steady, yet full of emotion. "I know what you've been through. I've been there, but I'm here to tell you that you are not alone and you are not defined by what was done to you. You can rebuild, you can heal, and you can find your way back to the world you deserve." The room was quiet, the weight of her words settling over the survivors like a comforting blanket. For the first time in years, Emily felt a sense of purpose, a feeling that her past, no matter how painful, had not been for nothing. It had shaped her into the woman she was today, and now she would use that strength to help others find their own paths to healing. Her father, who had supported her every step of the way, stood quietly in the back of the room, watching with pride. Their relationship had been fractured for years, but with time, they had begun to rebuild what was broken. The wounds of the past were still there, but they were healing, slowly. Together they had faced the truth, and they had started to find a way forward. They spent weekends together, talking, laughing, and supporting one another. The love they had once shared was growing stronger each day, like a garden that had been neglected but was finally being cared for and allowed to bloom once again. The town, however, had not forgotten what had happened. Whispers still lingered on the streets, and the name Linda Reynolds was forever tainted. The community had once revered her, never suspecting the dark secret she had been hiding. Now they spoke of her with contempt, their judgment a constant reminder of the betrayal she had inflicted. The old house Linda had once called her own stood empty, its grandeur now nothing more than a hollow shell. The people she had once charmed turned their backs on her, the life she had built on lies and cruelty now crumbling in her absence. Linda, now forgotten by the world that had once admired her, spent her days alone in prison, the reality of her actions setting in with each passing day. No longer did she command respect or fear. Instead, she was just another inmate, her name faded from the public eye. She had been powerful, once, rich, untouchable, invincible. But in the end, her greed had been her downfall. The very things she had stolen, the very life she had taken from Emily, were now lost to her forever. As the years passed, Emily and her father built something new, something stronger than the past. Emily helped others who had suffered like she had, becoming a beacon of hope for those who had once been voiceless. And though her scars would never disappear completely, she found peace in knowing that her story had the power to change lives. The past may have shaped her, but it would no longer define her. She was free, and in that freedom she had found her new beginning.